Barren in a shifter village means your own father will pay someone to drag you away. The morning started like any other lie I told myself. I kneaded bread with desperate force, my knuckles white against the dough, pretending each fold and turn was the baby my body refused to grow. The fire crackled in our stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the rough wooden walls of our cottage. Outside, the autumn wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the scent of coming snow and the distant howls of the pack on their morning hunt. My little sister Mira sat by the window, her golden hair catching the firelight as she mended one of Father's hunting shirts. At 16, she already drew stares from every unmated male in the village. Her wolf was strong, her scent fertile and promising. Everything I wasn't. Everything I would never be. "Thessa," she whispered, not looking up from her stitching. "The tax collector rides today." My hands stilled in the dough. We both knew what that meant. The Lichen King's demands had grown heavier with each moon, and our small mountain village had already given everything: crops, livestock, gold. There was only one currency left: daughters. "Father will protect us," I said, but the words tasted like ash. Mira's needle slipped, pricking her finger. A single drop of blood fell onto the white fabric, spreading like a crimson flower. She sucked her finger, eyes dark with worry. He can't protect what he can't sell. The truth hit like a physical blow. Mira was valuable, fertile, beautiful, destined to strengthen whatever pack claimed her. But me? I was 23 summers old with an empty womb and no wolf to call. In our world, that made me less than worthless. I was a burden. The thought had barely formed when the cottage door burst open without so much as a knock. I never heard the tax collector enter. One moment I was lost in my own despair, the next a stranger's shadow swallowed our hearth, blocking out the morning light. He stood in our doorway like death itself, tall and broad, wrapped in a black cloak that seemed to eat the light around it. When he pushed back his hood, I saw a face carved from winter stone, sharp cheekbones and a cruel mouth. But it was his eyes that made my blood freeze. Amber, glowing like molten gold, with pupils that contracted to slits in the firelight. Beta wolf, high-ranking, dangerous. "Taxes have doubled," he growled, his voice a low rumble that made the wooden walls vibrate. Those burning eyes swept the cottage, taking inventory of our meager possessions before settling on us with predatory interest. My father's arms tightened protectively around Mira, pulling her against his side. She was perfect, fertile, valuable, worth a dozen barren daughters like me. At 45, Father was still strong, his own wolf lending him the broad shoulders and steady hands that made him the village's best hunter. But now those hands trembled as he faced the collector. "We've given everything," Father said, voice carefully controlled. "The harvest, the winter stores, even my wife's jewelry. There's nothing left." The beta's lips curved in what might have been a smile if there'd been any warmth in it. "There's always something left, Hunter Gareth. The crown understands your difficulties, which is why His Majesty offers alternatives to gold." My stomach dropped. I pressed myself deeper into the shadowy corner by the kitchen shelves, a habit carved from years of making myself invisible. If I was small enough, quiet enough, maybe he wouldn't notice the broken thing cowering in the corner. But beta wolves were hunters by nature, and even broken things couldn't hide forever. His gaze found me anyway, those amber eyes raking over my slight frame with cold calculation. I saw the exact moment he scented my barrenness. His nostrils flared slightly, and his lip curled in disgust. "She'll do," he said, as if I were a sack of grain or a lame horse. "The broken one." The words fell into our cottage like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the warm air. My father's face went pale, his grip on Mira tightening until she winced. "Thessa is—" He started, then stopped, swallowing hard. "Barren," the collector finished, with brutal efficiency. "Wolfless. Unmated at 23. Yes, I can smell it on her."
He pulled a roll of parchment from his cloak, unfurling it with a sharp snap. According to the king's new decree, families may settle their debts with surplus daughters. Surplus. The word hit me like a slap, stealing the breath from my lungs. Is that what I was? Surplus material? Excess baggage to be discarded when times grew hard?
Father's silence stretched on, and with each heartbeat that passed without his protest, another piece of my heart crumbled. This was the man who taught me to track deer through fresh snow, who'd held me when I cried over my first broken heart, who'd promised he'd always protect me. Now he couldn't even meet my eyes. "Take her," he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. She's useless to the pack anyway." The words hit harder than any physical blow. Useless, broken, barren. Each label fell on me like stones, heavy and sharp, burying the girl I used to be under the weight of my failures. But something deep inside me, something that had nothing to do with wolves or fertility, refused to break completely. I lifted my chin, meeting the beta's amused gaze directly for the first time. "I'll go," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "But I want something in return." Father's head snapped up, eyes wide with shock. The collector raised one dark eyebrow, clearly entertained by the barren girl's sudden show of spine. "You're hardly in a position to bargain, little human," he drawled, but there was interest in his tone now. Curiosity. "Aren't I?" I stepped out of my corner, hands clenched at my sides to hide their trembling. "You need bodies to fill your quota. I'm offering to come willingly. No struggles, no scenes. Surely that's worth something." His amber eyes glittered with dark amusement. "What do you want?" I looked at Mira, memorizing her face, the soft curve of her cheek, the worried frown between her brows, the way her lower lip trembled as she fought back tears. "Swear my sister keeps her dowry," I said firmly. "All of it. The gold, the linens, the silver combs that belong to our mother. She'll need them when she mates." "That's a no," Mira started, but I cut her off with a sharp look. The collector considered this, head tilted like a predator evaluating prey. A reasonable request. Done. He made a note on his parchment with a quill that appeared from nowhere. "Anything else, bargaining girl?" Yes, I thought. Let me say goodbye properly. Let me hold my sister one more time. Let me tell her I love her, that none of this is her fault. But I knew better to push my luck with a beta who was already being more generous than necessary. Instead, I gave him what he wanted to see. Complete to capitulation. "No," I lied. "I'm ready."
But the real bargain I made was with myself, in the secret chambers of my heart, where even wolves couldn't scent deception. Survive one moon inside the Lichen King's castle. Stay alive long enough to find the parchment map, rumored to be hidden in his war room. The map that supposedly led to the witch who cursed me womb dead. Morwenna the Bone Binder, the crone who'd looked into my 15-year-old eyes and smiled as she spoke the words that would trap me in this half-life forever. If I could find her, if I could steal that map and escape the castle, maybe I could buy my fertility back. Not with the king's gold. I had no delusions about stealing from the most powerful shifter in the realm and living to spend it. No, I'd buy it back with something far more valuable. The truth about what the king really was and why he hid behind masks of fur and shadow. Because even broken girls could see things others missed. And I'd heard whispers in the market about the beast in the East Wing, about how no bride had ever emerged from his chambers alive, about how the king himself was never seen during the full moon. One way or another, I would find answers, and if those answers came with a price written in blood and starlight, well, I'd already paid worse. A guard appeared in the doorway, another beta with scars across his knuckles and violence in his stance. He grabbed my arm with fingers that could crush bone, hauling me toward the door.
I walked barefoot into the snow, leaving bloody footprints that the wind would erase within minutes. Behind me, the cottage windows glowed with warm yellow light, a vision of the home I would never see again. Father had already turned away, murmuring comfort to Mira. "Safe now," he whispered. "We're safe now." The word tasted like rust and broken promises. Chapter 2. The Servant's Entrance. The journey to the castle took 3 days through mountain passes that cut like frozen blades. They gave me a horse, old, sway-backed, with ribs showing through petchy fur, but at least it was transportation that didn't involve walking through knee-deep snow. The beta collector, who'd finally introduced himself as Commander Thorn, rode ahead on a massive black stallion that snorted steam in the frigid air. 2 guards flanked me, their horses strong and well-fed, a stark contrast to my pitiful mount.
No one spoke except to give curt orders. "Stop here. Water the horses. Eat this. Keep moving." I didn't mind the silence. It gave me time to think, to plan, to study my captors for weaknesses I might exploit later. Commander Thorn kept his left hand pressed to his ribs whenever he thought no one was looking, an old wound that still pained him. The guard on my right had a nervous habit of checking his sword hilt every few minutes, suggesting inexperience or fear. The one on my left never took his eyes off the tree line, scanning for threats with the paranoid intensity of someone who'd survived too many ambushes. All useful information for later. We climbed higher into the mountains, following roads that grew narrower and more treacherous with each mile. Ancient pines towered around us, their branches heavy with snow that occasionally crashed to the ground with sounds like thunder. The air grew thinner, harder to breathe, and I found myself grateful for my threadbare cloak despite its inadequacy against the mountain cold. On the second night, huddled around a meager fire while the guards took turns sleeping, I heard them howling in the distance. The king's pack, calling to each other across the peaks in voices that made my bones ache with longing for something I never possessed. What would it feel like, I wondered, to have another form waiting beneath your skin? To run on 4 legs through moonlit forests? To hunt with senses sharp enough to track a rabbit through fresh powder? To belong to something larger and stronger than your own fragile human frame? I would never know. The thought should have brought the familiar stab of grief, but instead I felt something else, a cold, sharp-edged determination that had nothing to do with self-pity. Let them have their wolves. I had something they didn't. I had nothing left to lose. We reached the castle at dawn on the 3rd day, when the sky was the color of old silver and the mountain peaks caught fire with the first touch of sunlight. I'd expected to approach through grand gates, to see banners flying and guards in gleaming armor standing at attention. Instead, they led me around to the back, to a service entrance hidden in the shadow of the east wing. A steep stone chute, slick with ice and stained with things I didn't want to identify, disappeared into the darkness below. "Down you go," Thorn said with false cheer, dismounting from his stallion. "The king breeds no lice in his castle." They didn't push me, I'll give them that much. But the alternative to climbing down willingly was being thrown, so I gathered what remained of my dignity and descended into the bowels of the castle. The chute spat me out into a washing chamber that smelled of lye soap and copper pennies. Stone walls wept with condensation, and the floor was slick with water that might have been clean once, but now carried the metallic tang of old blood. A woman waited for me in the shadows, elderly with iron gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes like chips of black flint. Her dress was simple but well made, marking her as upper-level staff, and she held herself with the rigid posture of someone accustomed to absolute authority in her domain. "Strip," she commanded without preamble, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "The king breeds no lice, and I'll not have some mountain peasant bringing vermin into my castle."
I peeled off my travel-stained clothes, the rough wool dress I'd worn since leaving home, the thin chemise underneath, the worn boots that had carried me through 3 days of mountain passes. Each garment told the story of my journey, and I found myself folding them with defiant neatness, a small act of rebellion against the way they were treating me like livestock. The hag, for that's what she was, despite her human appearance, pointed to a stone trough filled with water that steamed in the cold air. Ice crystals floated on the surface, and I realized with growing dread that this was no gentle washing. This was punishment disguised as necessity. I stepped into the trough and immediately understood why previous girls might have screamed. The water was scalding hot, heated by some mechanism I couldn't see, and the shock of it against my travel-chilled skin felt like being flayed alive. My skin screamed, nerves firing in protest, but I bit down on the sound that wanted to tear from my throat. I would not give them the satisfaction of hearing me break. The hag produced a brush with bristles that felt like steel wire and proceeded to scrub every inch of my body with methodical brutality. She worked in silence, scouring away dirt and dead skin and pride with equal efficiency. By the time she finished, I was raw and bleeding in places, my skin bright red and hypersensitive. She inspected her work with the critical eye of a craftsman, then nodded approvingly. "Better," she pronounced, tossing me a rough towel that abraded my tender skin. "Dress." The garment she provided was a simple gray shift, rough woven but clean, with long sleeves and a hemline that brushed my ankles. It was shapeless, designed to hide rather than flatter, but it was warm and dry and smelled of lavender soap rather than travel and fear. "I am Mistress Olga," the hag said as I struggled with the unfamiliar ties at the shift's neckline. "I run the servants' quarters in this castle, and you'll obey my every word without question. Clear?" "Yes, Mistress Olga."
"Good. You're to entertain it tonight." The casual way she said it made ice form in my veins. Not him. Not the king. It. "It?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. Her smile was razor thin, an expression that belonged on a wolf's muzzle rather than a human face. "The thing in the East Wing, the master's entertainment. Fail to amuse it, and you'll amuse the executioner instead." She turned and walked toward a heavy wooden door I hadn't noticed before, her footsteps echoing off the stone walls. At the threshold, she paused, looking back over her shoulder with eyes that glared with something that might have been pity. 24 hours until that door opens, girl. If you're smart, you'll spend them praying to whatever gods still listen to broken things like you." The door slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid, leaving me alone in the washing chamber with the ghost scent of lye and the whisper of my own ragged breathing. 24 hours to find the map and figure out how to survive whatever waited in the East Wing. 24 hours to prove that broken things could still have sharp edges. I pressed my hand against the stone wall, feeling the ancient power that thrummed through the castle's bones like a slow heartbeat, and began to plan. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Servants' Hall. Mistress Olga led me through a maze of narrow corridors that twisted through the castle's foundation like the burrows of some massive creature. The walls were rough stone, carved from the living mountain, and torches flickered in iron sconces that cast dancing shadows across our path. Other servants moved through these tunnels like ghosts. A kitchen maid with flour-dusted hands, a stable boy carrying harnesses that reeked of leather and horse sweat, laundry women bent under the weight of basket loads of linens. They all stepped aside when they saw Olga, pressing themselves against the walls with expressions of mingled fear and respect. None of them looked at me directly,
but I caught glimpses of their faces in my peripheral vision. Some showed pity, others curiosity, and a few, the older women especially, wore expressions of grim satisfaction, as if they were thinking, better her than me. We climbed a spiral staircase carved into the castle's outer wall. The steps were worn smooth by countless feet. Through arrow slits that served as windows, I caught glimpses of the courtyard far below, where guards in black and silver livery practiced sword forms in the early morning light.
The servants' quarters, Olga announced as we emerged onto a long corridor lined with doors. You'll share with the other girls assigned to the East Wing. She pushed open a door to reveal a small chamber that managed to be both spartanly furnished and somehow cozy. 4 narrow beds lined the walls, each with a wooden chest at its foot and a peg for hanging clothes. A small brazier provided warmth, and the single window looked out over the forest that stretched away from the castle's base. 3 other girls looked up as we entered. The youngest couldn't have been more than 16, with mouse-brown hair and nervous eyes that darted between Olga and me like a trapped animal's. The second was perhaps my age, with the calloused hands of someone who worked in the kitchens and a face that might have been pretty if it weren't so carefully blank of expression. The third was older, maybe 30, with premature silver threading through her dark hair and scars on her forearms that spoke of kitchen accidents or something worse. "This is Thessa," Olga said curtly. "She'll be occupying the 4th bed. I trust you'll explain the rules." She left without another word, and the silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, the oldest girl, the one with the silver-streaked hair, spoke. "I'm Vera," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Kitchen staff mostly, but they rotate us through different duties depending on need." She gestured to the others. "This is Penny, the nervous 16-year-old, and Joanna, the blank-faced kitchen worker." "Thessa," I said, though they already knew that. "I'm new to castle service?" Joanna snorted, a sound devoid of humor. "We're all new to castle service. The East Wing doesn't keep staff long enough for anyone to get experienced." "Why?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. The 3 girls exchanged glances loaded with meaning. It was Penny who finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "The beast," she said. "The thing the king keeps in the East Wing. It eats them." "Don't be dramatic," Vera said sharply, but her tone lacked conviction. "We don't know what happens to them, they just don't come back." "How many?" "Since I've been here," Vera counted on her fingers. 7, maybe 8. They blurred together after a while. 8 girls. 8 lives snuffed out to feed whatever lived in the East Wing. I thought of their families, probably told their daughters had died of fever or accident, never knowing the truth about what had become of them. Would my father tell Mira I died of fever? Would she mourn me, or would she simply be grateful that her own future was secure? "What exactly are we supposed to do?" I asked, pushing the dark thoughts aside. I needed practical information if I was going to survive the night. "Entertain it," Joanna said with bitter emphasis. "Tell stories, sing songs, dance if you can. Keep it amused until dawn. If you succeed, you live to see another sunset. If you fail..." She didn't need to finish that sentence. "Has anyone ever succeeded?" I asked. Another exchange of glances. This time it was Vera who answered, her voice heavy with old grief. "Once. A girl named Sarah. She lasted 3 nights. We thought, we hoped..." She shook her head. "On the 4th night, we heard screaming. The next morning, Olga teamed for new sheets." The implication hit me like a physical blow. Even success was only temporary. The beast's appetite could be delayed, but never permanently satisfied.
Is there any way to avoid it? I asked desperately. Could someone hide or... No. Penny's voice was firm despite her youth. Olga counts us every evening. Missing girls get dragged to the East Wing in chains, and the beast doesn't like its entertainment to come gift-wrapped in iron. I sank onto the narrow bed that would be mine, for however long I survived, mind racing. There had to be something, some weakness, some pattern, some way to turn the situation to my advantage. Tell me about the beast, I said. What does it look like? How does it behave? You'll find out tonight, Joanna said, with bitter emphasis. Those of us who've never seen it, they'll get details from those who have. Part of the entertainment, I suppose. Fresh fear. But Vera, I noticed, looked uncomfortable with that answer. She kept glancing at the door as if worried about being overheard, then leaned forward and lowered her voice to barely a whisper. There are stories, she said reluctantly, whispers from the other servants. They say it's huge, 7 feet tall at least, with claws that can rend stone. They say it speaks, but its voice is like grinding stone and old blood. What does it want? I pressed, besides entertainment. Stories, Penny said unexpectedly. We all turned to look at her, and she flushed under the attention. My cousin worked in the kitchens before she went to the East Wing. She said the beast always asked for stories, specific kinds of stories. What kinds? Stories about curses, Penny whispered. About monsters becoming men, and men becoming monsters. About magic that could transform or trap or free. That was interesting. Significant, maybe. A beast that was fascinated by transformation magic. What did that suggest about its own nature? There's something else, Vera added after another worried glance at the door. The king. Have you ever noticed he's never seen during the full moon? For 3 days each month, he vanishes completely. No court sessions, no audiences, no public appearances. I had noticed, actually. Even in our remote mountain village, we'd heard about the king's peculiar schedule. Most rulers use the full moon to demonstrate their power, shifting into their wolf forms and leading pack hunts that strengthen their authority. King Darius was the opposite. He disappeared, leaving his court to speculate and his enemies to wonder. You think the king and the beast are connected somehow? I asked. I think asking too many questions gets servants thrown in the dungeon, Joanna said firmly, and I'd rather face the beast than the torturer's tools. The conversation died after that, but my mind continued racing. Pieces of a puzzle were scattered around me. A beast obsessed with transformation magic, a king who vanished during full moons, stories about curses and monsters. If I could fit them together, maybe I could find a way to survive long enough to locate the map I needed. The rest of the day passed in a blur of instruction and preparation. Vera showed me how to navigate the servants' corridors, taught me the hand signals the staff used to communicate in areas where silence was required, and explained the complex hierarchy that governed castle life. Olga ruled the servants' quarters with absolute authority, but she answered to the seneschal, who answered to the various nobles who comprised the king's inner circle. Below Olga were the department heads, head cook, master of arms, chief groom, and below them were the rank-and-file servants like us. It was a rigid system designed to keep order and prevent rebellion. But like all rigid systems, it had cracks. Servants who could move between departments, guards who looked the other way for the right price, nobles who paid more attention to their own political games than the staff who served them. All potential opportunities for someone clever enough to exploit them. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, casting long shadows through our small window, the atmosphere in our chamber grew increasingly tense. Penny sat on her bed hugging her knees, occasionally whimpering under her breath. Joanna paced back and forth, her movements sharp and agitated. Vera simply stared at the wall, her expression distant and resigned. I used the time to study my reflection in the small mirror hung beside the wash basin. The girl looking back at me was thin and sharp-edged, with dark hair that fell in waves to her shoulders, and gray eyes that held too much knowledge for someone barely past 20. My face was angular rather than beautiful, more fox than dove, but there was intelligence there, cunning. I would need both to survive the night. As the last light faded from our window, we heard footsteps in the corridor outside, heavy, measured, accompanied by the jingle of keys. Olga was coming. My hands began to shake, and I clenched them into fists to hide the trembling. Whatever waited in the east wing, whatever price I would have to pay to see another sunrise, I was as ready as I could be. The footsteps stopped outside our door. Chapter 4. The Beast's First Riddle. The collar of diamond stars clicked shut around my throat like a verdict. Olga had dragged me from the servants' quarters without ceremony, through corridors that grew progressively grander as we moved away from the working areas of the castle. Here, tapestries covered the stone walls, depicting scenes of hunts and battles and noble ceremonies. Thick carpets muffled our footsteps, and crystal chandeliers cast warm light over furniture that probably cost more than my village's entire annual harvest. But as we entered the east wing, the atmosphere changed dramatically. The tapestries here were darker, showing scenes of transformation. Humans becoming wolves, wolves becoming men, and stranger things that defied easy categorization. The very air felt heavier, charged with a power that made my skin prickle and my teeth ache. The king's entertainment demands appropriate attire, Olga had said, fastening the collar around my throat with hands that didn't quite tremble. The diamonds were real. I could tell by the way they caught and fractured the candlelight into rainbow shards, but their beauty couldn't disguise the weight of the thing. It was a shackle, beautiful but undeniably binding. She'd also given me a gown to replace the simple gray shift, midnight blue silk that clung to my slight frame and pulled around my feet like liquid shadow. The neckline was cut low enough to display the diamond collar, and the sleeves were long and flowing, designed more for elegance than practicality. I felt like a sacrifice being prepared for an altar. Now I stood alone in the beast's banquet hall, waiting. The room was enormous, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadows and walls lined with mirrors that reflected my image back at me from a dozen angles. A massive table dominated the center of the space, carved from a single piece of black oak and polished to a gleam that rivaled the mirrors. Candles guttered in a draft I couldn't feel, their flames dancing as if stirred by invisible hands. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the whisper of my own breathing and the soft rustle of silk as I shifted nervously. Then, at the far end of the banquet hall, a shadow peeled itself from the wall. My breath caught in my throat as it moved into the candlelight, and I understood why previous girls had screamed. It was massive, 7 feet tall at least, with shoulders bent like a gargoyle and arms that hung nearly to the floor. Coarse black fur covered its body, and when it moved, I could hear the click of claws against the marble floor. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. They burned with intelligence that was unmistakably human, golden and ancient and infinitely sad. This wasn't some mindless monster. This was something that had once been a man, trapped now in a form that belonged to nightmares. It settled at the far end of the banquet hall, moving with surprising grace for something so large. When it rested its chin on the polished wood, I saw that its face was a bizarre hybrid of human and wolf. Elongated snout filled with teeth like daggers, but expressions that flickered across its features with human complexity. "Tell me a story," it rasped, and I had to bite back a whimper at the sound of its voice. The words were clear enough, but they came from a throat never designed for human speech, creating tones that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. End it with a riddle. If I cannot answer, you live to see another sunset. The scent that accompanied its voice was pine sap and old blood, earth after rain, and something else, something that reminded me of the moment lightning strikes, ozone and electricity, and power barely contained. I swallowed the scream that was clawing its way up my throat and forced myself to think. A story with a riddle. Something to amuse a creature that probably heard every tale the previous girls could invent. But I had advantages they hadn't possessed. I'd grown up listening to my grandmother's stories, the old tales that reached back to the days before the Great Kingdoms, when magic flowed through the world like water, and transformation was as common as breathing. More importantly, I had my own story, the tale of a Barren girl cast out by her family, sold to settle debts she hadn't incurred. Sometimes, the most powerful stories were the ones that hurt to tell. Once, there lived a girl born without a wolf, I began, my voice steady despite the terror that clawed at my ribs. I wove truth into myth, crafting a tale of a maiden cursed by a jealous witch, scorned by her pack, sold to the highest bidder when her family's fortunes turned sour. As I spoke, the beast settled more comfortably, its golden eyes never leaving my face. There was something hungry in its attention, but not the physical hunger I had expected. This was the hunger of someone who had been starved of companionship, of understanding, of stories that acknowledged the pain of transformation. I told him how the girl discovered she was different, how she watched others shift into their wolf forms while her own body remained stubbornly human. I described her family's growing disappointment, the way they began to speak around her rather than to her, how she became a ghost in her own home. But then I twisted the ending, giving my fictional heroine the power I'd never possessed. In my story, the cursed girl discovered that her lack of a wolf had freed her from the limitations that bound others. She could see through illusions that fooled even the strongest shifters. She could walk paths that were barred to those who carried wolves in their souls. And in the end, she used those abilities to steal the witch's power, turning the curse back on its creator. She bound the witch's magic in chains of starlight, I continued, watching the beast's ears prick forward with interest. And when the old crone begged for mercy, the girl smiled and said, "I will free you when you have learned what it means to be powerless." The witch remains trapped to this day, her magic sealed away, waiting for the lesson to sink deep enough to transform her heart. I paused, letting the story settle between us like dust motes in candlelight. The beast's breathing had grown deeper, more regular, and I realized with surprise that my tale had affected it more than I had expected. Now for the riddle. I thought carefully, drawing on the words my grandmother had taught me, riddles that had been old when the mountains were young. I am held by those who cannot touch me, broken by those who never speak me, kept by those who never sought me. What am I? The beast's ears flattened against its skull, and it began to pace the length of the table with restless energy. Its claws left furrows in the polished wood as it walked, and I could see the thoughts racing behind those golden eyes. The riddle wasn't meant to be easy. It was a test of understanding, rather than logic, requiring insight into the nature of bonds that existed beyond the physical world. I'd chosen it specifically because it spoke to my own situation, trapped by promises and expectations I'd never made or wanted. The beast pondered until the eastern sky began to blush with the first hint of dawn. I stood frozen in place, not daring to move or speak while it worked through the puzzle. My legs ached from standing so long, and the diamond collar had begun to chafe against my throat. but I endured the discomfort in silence. Finally, as the first rays of sunlight penetrated the hall's tall windows, the beast stopped pacing and looked directly at me. "A promise," it whispered, and I felt something tight in my chest finally relax.
The collar sprang open and clattered to the floor with a sound like breaking glass. I gasped, one hand flying to my throat, feeling the shallow indentations the diamonds had pressed into my skin. I had survived the first night. As the beast turned away, already beginning to retreat into whatever shadows it called home, I noticed something that made my heart race with sudden hope. Beneath its massive paw, almost hidden by the carnage it had left on the table's surface, lay a small, leather-bound book. A diary, bound with a single black feather and emanating the faint scent of smoke and lavender. The same scent that had clung to Morwenna's robes 5 winters ago, when she'd smiled at me with those cold, dark eyes and spoken the words that had stolen my future. Day 1 survived. But now I had something far more valuable than mere survival. I had a lead. Chapter 5. The Kitchen Boy's Secret. They led me back to the servants' quarters before full sunrise, my legs shaking with exhaustion and the aftershock of survival. Vera, Joanna, and Penny looked up as Olga pushed me through the door, their faces showing a mixture of relief and surprise that I suspect had become grimly familiar over the months. "Well," Olga said with grudging approval, "you're the first to last the full night in 3 moons. Don't let it go to your head, girl. 1 night means nothing in the grand scheme." She shoved a tin cup of goat's milk into my hands, warm with honey swirled through it, a luxury I hadn't tasted since childhood. "Drink, eat, rest. The king expects you again tomorrow dusk." Tomorrow. The word hit me like a physical weight. 1 night of survival meant nothing if I couldn't repeat the performance, and I had no guarantee that the same strategy would work twice. The beast had seemed pleased with my story and riddle, but novelty was part of the appeal. What would I offer tonight? More importantly, how could I get close enough to that diary to examine it properly? As Olga left us alone, my 3 roommates crowded around me with desperate hunger for details. "What was it like?" Penny whispered, her young face pale with morbid curiosity. "Did it try to hurt you?" Joanna asked, more practical in her concerns. But it was Vera who asked the question that mattered. "Did you learn anything useful?" I looked at each of them carefully, weighing how much to reveal. These girls had been kind to me, had shared what little they knew about surviving in the castle, but that didn't mean I could trust them completely. In a place like this, information was currency, and loose tongues could get you killed faster than any beast. "It likes stories," I said finally, choosing my words with care, especially stories about transformation, about curses and magic. "It's intelligent, more intelligent than anyone gives it credit for, and it's lonely." The last observation slipped out before I could stop it, but it was true. Beneath the monster's terrible exterior, I'd sensed a profound isolation that resonated with my own experiences of being cast out and forgotten. "Lonely enough to spare your life," Vera observed. "For 1 night. Tomorrow might be different." I curled up on my narrow bed, pulling the thin blanket over my head to signal that I wanted to sleep, but my mind was racing too fast for rest. The diary haunted my thoughts. So close, yet impossibly distant. How could I get my hands on it without the beast noticing? And even if I managed that miracle, how could I read it without being caught? The questions churned in my head as exhaustion finally claimed me, dragging me down into dreams filled with golden eyes and the scent of smoke and lavender. I awoke to the sound of someone moving quietly through our chamber. The light filtering through our small window suggested late afternoon. I'd slept most of the day away. Penny and Joanna were gone, presumably at their afternoon duties, but Vera sat on her bed mending a torn apron. The person moving through our room wasn't one of my roommates. A boy. No, young man, though he couldn't have been more than 15.
crouched beside my bed, his movements careful and silent. He had the lean build of someone who worked in the kitchens, with hands that were clean, but bore the small burns and cuts that came from handling hot pots and sharp knives. His hair was sandy brown, falling into eyes the color of storm-washed glass. When he saw that I was awake, he pressed a finger to his lips and glanced meaningfully at Vera. I followed his gaze and saw that she'd gone very still, her needle poised mid-stitch, but she wasn't looking at us. The slight tension in her shoulders suggested she was listening, but she made no move to interfere. Interesting. Either this boy had allies among the servants, or Vera had her own reasons for staying out of castle business. He leaned close, his breath warm against my ear as he whispered words that made my heart skip a beat.
You survived the East Wing. It wasn't a question, and his tone suggested he'd known I would succeed when others had failed. That raised troubling questions about what this boy knew and how he'd learned it. I nodded carefully, not trusting my voice to remain quiet enough. He glanced around once more, then pressed something small and cold into my palm. A key made of black iron, its surface etched with symbols I didn't recognize, but that made my skin tingle with residual magic. Opens the old library, he breathed, each word barely audible. 3rd floor, West Wing. Maps live there. So do ghosts. Choose quickly which you want to meet. Before I could ask any of the dozen questions crowding my throat, he was gone, slipping out of our chamber with the same silent grace he'd used to enter. I lay still for however long, the key burning against my palm like a coal, before sitting up and examining it more closely. The iron was old. I could tell by the way it had developed a patina that spoke of centuries rather than decades. The symbols etched into its surface seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them, suggesting the involvement of magic that was both powerful and ancient. You never saw him, Vera said quietly, not looking up from her mending. Saw who? I replied, understanding the game we were playing. Exactly. She tied off her thread and bit it clean, then looked at me directly for the first time since I'd woken. Some secrets are worth keeping. Others will get you killed. Learn to tell the difference. I slipped the key into the hidden pocket I'd sewn into my shift seam, feeling its weight settle against my hip like a promise. A library. Maps. The possibility of finding information about the castle's layout, about the beast, about the connection between the king and the creature that haunted the East Wing. But first, I needed to survive another night of entertainment. Vera, I said carefully, what do you know about the kitchen staff? She raised an eyebrow. Dangerous question. Why do you ask? Just curious about who's who in the castle. Understanding the hierarchy. She studied me for a long moment, then seemed to reach some internal decision. The kitchens are run by Cook Barren, a woman who's been here since before the current king took the throne. She tolerates no nonsense and protects her people like a mother wolf protects her cubs. Most of the kitchen staff are local hires, sons and daughters of farmers and crafters who needed work. Most?
There are a few who came from elsewhere, refugees from the eastern provinces mostly, after the blight destroyed their harvests 3 summers ago. They're grateful for the work, which makes them loyal. They also tend to keep their heads down and their mouths shut, which makes them valuable. Anyone in particular I should know about? Vera's expression grew thoughtful. There's a boy named Corin. Sandy hair, storm gray eyes, maybe 15 summers. Came here 2 years ago after his family died in a fire. He's different. Different how? Like you, she said simply. Wolfless. Half thing, they call him in the kitchens, though never where Cook Barren can hear. She's protective of her strays. My pulse quickened.
The boy who'd given me the key was named Corin. I was willing to bet, and if he was like me, human in a world of shifters, then he understood what it meant to be powerless in a place designed for those with claws and fangs. That understanding could make him an ally, or it could make him desperate enough to sell information to whoever offered the best price. I would have to be very careful how I handled Corin, kitchen boy and keeper of secrets. "Thank you," I said to Vera, meaning it, for the information and for not seeing things. She smiled, an expression that transformed her stern features into something almost beautiful. "We outcasts have to stick together. The wolves certainly won't protect us." As if summoned by her words, Olga's voice echoed down the corridor, calling for the evening's entertainment to prepare herself. My stomach clenched with familiar dread, but underneath the fear was something new. A spark of anticipation that had everything to do with the diary waiting beneath the beast's paw and the key burning against my hip. Tonight, I would tell another story, but more importantly, I would begin gathering the tools I needed to rewrite my own ending. Chapter 6: The Diary of Smoke and Lavender. The beast was waiting for me when I entered the banquet hall, and this time I noticed details I'd missed the night before. The way it favored its left side, suggesting an old injury. The careful precision with which it moved, as if every gesture required thought and planning. The mirror positioned behind its chair, angled so it could see the entire room without turning its massive head.
This was a creature that had learned to be cautious, to expect threats from any direction. That spoke of intelligence, yes, but also of pain. Something had taught it that safety was an illusion and vigilance was survival. I could relate. "You return," it said as I took my position at the opposite end of the table. Tonight they'd given me a gown of deep green silk that made my pale skin look even more ethereal, and the diamond collar felt lighter somehow, though I knew that was probably wishful thinking. "Did you expect me to run?" I asked, surprising myself with my boldness. The beast's eyes, those startling golden eyes that seemed to see straight through me, crinkled slightly at the corners. If it had been human, I might have called the expression amusement. "Most do," it rumbled. "In their minds, if not with their feet. They stand where you stand and dream of escape, of rescue, of anything but the present moment." "And what do you dream of?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, far too personal for the formal dance we were supposed to be performing. The beast went very still, and for a moment I thought I'd overstepped fatally. Then it laughed, a sound like stones grinding together, but with a note of genuine humor underneath. "Clever girl," it said. "You ask the questions instead of simply answering them, but I am not here to be entertained. That is your role." "Of course." I smoothed my hands over the green silk, buying time while I decided what story to tell tonight. "What would you like to hear?" "Something true," it said. "No myths tonight. No fairy tales dressed up in pretty words. Tell me something real." Real? The word hung between us like a challenge. What reality could I share with this creature that wouldn't expose too much of my own vulnerability? And yet, hadn't vulnerability been what saved me last night? My story about the cursed girl had resonated precisely because it came from genuine pain. "Very well," I said, and began to speak about the day my world ended. I told him about Joran, the young alpha who'd courted me when we were both barely more than children. How he'd promised to wait for my wolf to emerge, swearing that love would be enough even if it never came. I described our mating ceremony, small but joyful, held in the village square on a crisp autumn morning when the mountains were painted gold with changing leaves. And then I told him about the years that followed, how Joran's patience began to fray as season after season passed without the child we both wanted,
how his family started making pointed comments about getting his money's worth from the mating bond, how he began coming home later and later, his clothes carrying the scents of other women. "I knew it was over the night he brought her to our cottage," I said, my voice steady despite the old pain that clawed at my ribs. Beautiful, young, her belly already rounding with his child. He didn't even try to hide what she was to him. The beast had gone utterly motionless as I spoke, its golden eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that should have been frightening. Instead, I found it strangely comforting to have someone listen with such complete attention.
"What did you do?"
it asked when I paused. "I congratulated him," I said simply. I wished them both happiness, and then I asked him to release me from the mating bond.
"He agreed?"
He was relieved. The bond was just a burden to him by then, a legal obstacle preventing him from claiming his true meat. I touched my chest, where the phantom pain of that severing still sometimes ached. He tore it out the same night. No ceremony, no witnesses, just him, me, and the sound of something precious breaking. The beast was quiet for a long time after I finished. When it finally spoke, its voice was softer than I'd ever heard it.
"You stand."
"Barely," I admitted, echoing my words from the night before.
"But you do stand.
That requires a strength most would never understand." There was something in its tone, a recognition, a kinship, that made me wonder what losses had shaped the creature before me. But before I could find a way to ask, it straightened and returned to the formal distance of our prescribed roles.
"Your riddle."
I thought carefully. Last night's riddle had been about promises and the bonds that held us. Tonight, after sharing my story of love lost and betrayal endured, I wanted something that spoke to the nature of survival itself. I am forged in darkness, tempered by pain, stronger for breaking, polished by strain. What seems my weakness becomes my might. What am I that turns shadow to light? The beast began to pace again, but this time its movements were less agitated, more thoughtful. It circled the table once, twice, 3 times, claws clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. I used its distraction to study the space around its chair more carefully. Yes, there was the diary I'd glimpsed the night before, partially hidden beneath a silver plate that held the remains of some meal. The black feather that bound it seemed to pulse with its own dark light, and the scent of smoke and lavender was stronger here, almost overpowering. How could I get to it? The beast never moved far from that end of the table, and even if it did, I couldn't simply snatch the book and run. I needed a more subtle approach, something that would let me examine it without being caught. "Resilience," the beast said suddenly, stopping mid-pace to look at me. "The answer is resilience." I blinked, dragged back from my planning to the present moment. "Yes," I said, impressed despite myself. "That's correct." The collar clicked open and fell to the floor, but this time I barely noticed its release. All my attention was focused on what happened next. The beast moved toward its chair, toward the hidden diary, and for a moment I thought my chance had come. But instead of settling into its usual position, it swept the diary up in one massive paw and held it out toward me. "You've been staring at this all evening," it said, and I felt my blood turn to ice. Had I been that obvious? "Perhaps you'd like to examine it more closely." It was a test. It had to be. Some trap designed to reveal my true motives, my desperate hunger for information about the witch who'd cursed me. If I reached for the book, would claws close around my throat? Would this be the moment my survival came to an end? But if I didn't take it, I might never get another chance. Yes, I said, extending my hand with carefully controlled composure. I would. The beast placed a diary in my palm, its claws brushing my skin with surprising gentleness. The leather was warm. From its touch or some inner magic, I couldn't tell. And the moment my fingers closed around it, I felt a jolt of recognition that went deeper than scent or sight. This book had belonged to Moena. I was certain of it. Be careful, the beast warned, as I opened the cover to reveal pages covered in spidery handwriting. Some knowledge carries a price steeper than gold. I began to read, and with each word, my understanding of my situation and my hope for escape transformed completely. The curse is not what he believes it to be. The transformation was meant to be temporary, a lesson in humility that would fade when true understanding was achieved. But pride is a poison that corrupts even the purest magic. Instead of learning, he has festered. Instead of growing, he has diminished. The girl who can break the binding will be one who knows transformation from the inside, not the dramatic shifting of wolf to human, but the quieter, deeper change that comes from surviving loss. She will be broken, but not destroyed, wounded, but not weak. She will see through the monster's mask to the man beneath, not because she is naive, but because she recognizes her own reflection in his pain. When such a girl arrives, the binding can be broken with a simple truth, the willing speaking of his real name. Not the title he hides behind, not the crown that has become his cage, but the name his mother whispered when he was nothing more than a child afraid of the dark. I have bound this knowledge in blood and starlight, sealed it with my own transformation. Only one who shares his curse, the curse of being neither one thing nor another, can read these words. If you are reading this, daughter of neither world, then the end has finally come within reach. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the book. This wasn't just Morwenna's diary, it was a guide, a manual for breaking the very curse I'd come here to escape. But the implications were staggering. The beast wasn't the king's pet or prisoner. The beast was the king, transformed by magic that had gone wrong, trapped in a form that matched his inner darkness until someone could reach the man he'd been before power corrupted him. And somehow, impossibly, I was the key to freeing him. Interesting reading? The beast, the king, asked, and now I could hear the carefully hidden intelligence in his voice, the education that had shaped his speech patterns, the loneliness of someone who had been isolated from human connection for far too long. Very, I managed, closing the book with hands that still trembled. Thank you for sharing it. Keep it, he said, settling back into his chair. I suspect you'll have need of it before our association ends. The eastern sky was already beginning to lighten, signaling the end of another night. But as I tucked the diary into the hidden pocket of my gown, I realized that everything had changed. I hadn't just survived 2 nights in the beast's presence, I'd discovered the secret that could set us both free. The question now was whether I had the courage to use it. Chapter 7. The Library of Whispers. The key turned in the lock without a sound, as if the magic woven into the metal had muffled even the smallest noise. I stepped into the old library and immediately understood why Corin warned me about ghosts. The air itself seemed alive with whispers, not quite voices, but something that suggested the echoes of countless conversations held within these walls over the centuries. Moonlight slanted through tall windows, their stained glass casting patterns of blue and silver across dusty floors. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with books whose leather spines gleamed like old gold in the fractured light.
It was beautiful and terrible, and utterly silent except for those phantom whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I closed the door behind me and stood for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dimness. The library was larger than I'd expected, with reading alcoves tucked between the stacks and tables scattered throughout the space like islands in a sea of knowledge. At the far end, a massive desk dominated a raised platform, and behind it, my breath caught in my throat. Behind the desk was a wall covered in maps. I moved through the library like a ghost myself, careful not to disturb the dust motes that danced in the moonbeams or the books that seemed to lean inward from their shelves as if eager to share their secrets. The whispers followed me, growing stronger as I approached the map wall until I could almost make out individual words. Here, she came here, the witch, the binding, blood and starlight. The maps were works of art as much as navigation aids, drawn on parchment so old it was nearly transparent and illuminated with gold leaf that still caught the light after centuries. Some showed the kingdom as it existed now, with borders and roads and major cities clearly marked. Others reached back into history, showing the land as it had been before the Great Consolidation, when dozens of small kingdoms and city-states had dotted the landscape like stars in a sea. But it was the map tucked into the corner, almost hidden behind a larger chart of the eastern provinces, that made my heart race with recognition. The Whispering Wood. Every tree was drawn in meticulous detail, every stream and path marked with symbols that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. And there, in the deepest part of the forest, where even the king's hunters feared to go, was a cave marked with a sigil I knew all too well. A crescent moon split by a thorn, Morwenna's mark. The witch's cave, I breathed, reaching out to trace the path marked on the ancient parchment. It would be a 3-day journey on foot, 4 if the weather was bad, through terrain that had claimed the lives of experienced hunters and seasoned soldiers. But it was possible. The maps showed water sources, marked dangerous areas to avoid, even indicated the best places to make camp along the way. Someone, Morwenna herself perhaps, wanted this path to be found. The question was, why?
I was so absorbed in studying the map that I almost didn't hear the footsteps in the corridor outside. When they registered, ice flooded my veins. Guards, multiple sets of boots, moving with the measured pace of a patrol. I looked around frantically for somewhere to hide, but the library offered little cover. The reading alcoves were too exposed, the desk too obvious, and the stacks. If I could get deep enough into the maze of shelves, perhaps I could find a dark corner where even wolf senses wouldn't detect me. I darted between the towering bookcases, following a path that twisted and turned like a labyrinth. The whispers grew stronger here, more insistent, and I began to catch fragments that made my skin crawl. Blood on the stones, screaming in the night. She promised immortality but delivered only hunger. The footsteps in the corridor paused outside the library door. I held my breath, pressing myself against a shelf filled with books whose titles were written in languages I didn't recognize. The leather bindings were warm against my back, as if the knowledge contained within generated its own heat. A key rattled in the lock. My heart hammered so loudly I was certain it would give me away, but the guards seemed to be conducting only a cursory check.
I heard them enter, pause for a moment, then retreat. The door closed and locked again, leaving me alone with the whispers and the shadows. I waited until their footsteps faded completely before moving again. When I finally felt safe enough to return to the map wall, I found something that made my blood turn cold. The map of the Whispering Wood was gone. In its place hung a different chart, one showing the castle's layout in far more detail than any servant should possess. Every corridor was marked, every room labeled, every secret passage outlined in fading red ink, including a passage that ran from the old library directly to the east wing. I stared at the map, mind racing. Had it changed on its own, responding to some magical trigger I'd unknowingly activated? Or had someone else been in the library with me? Someone who'd moved through the shadows while I hid in the stacks? The thought of unseen watchers made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to study the new map carefully. If I was going to survive much longer in this place, I needed to understand its hidden geography. The passage from the library to the east wing was particularly interesting. It seemed to emerge directly into the beast's banquet hall behind a tapestry that depicted a hunting scene.
That knowledge might prove useful, but first I had another problem to solve. The map I needed, the one showing the path to Morwenna's cave, had vanished. Either someone had taken it, or it had never been there at all. Or perhaps... I returned to the map wall and began examining the other charts more carefully. Ancient magic was subtle, layered, full of hidden meanings and concealed truths. If the witch had wanted to hide information in plain sight, she wouldn't have done it obviously. It took me nearly an hour of careful searching, but finally I found it. Not a separate map, but symbols worked into the border decoration of the kingdom's main chart. A tree here, a stream there, a small symbol that looked like a flower, but was actually a carefully disguised cave opening. Someone would have to know exactly what to look for to recognize the pattern, but once seen, it was unmistakable. The path to Morwenna's cave was there, hidden in the decorative elements of a map that thousands of people had probably studied over the years. Brilliant and terrifying. I traced the hidden route with my fingertip, memorizing every landmark and waypoint. The journey would be treacherous, especially for someone traveling alone, but it was possible. More than possible. It was my best hope of finding the witch and bargaining for the return of my fertility, assuming I could escape the castle alive. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten outside the tall windows, warning me that dawn was approaching. Soon, the castle would wake and servants would be expected at their duties. I needed to return to my quarters before my absence was noticed. But as I turned to leave, one of the whispers grew suddenly clear, cutting through the general murmur like a blade. "The girl in green silk. She reads the forbidden knowledge. She will bring the ending or the beginning." I spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but the library was empty except for shadows and moonbeams. The whisper faded back into the general murmur, leaving me with the unsettling certainty that I wasn't as alone in this place as I'd believed. Magic had many faces, and not all of them were friendly. I made my way back through the stacks to the door, but as I reached for the handle, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Fresh footprints in the dust, not my own, but someone else's. Someone who had entered the library after me and moved through the space while I was distracted by the maps. The prints were small, almost delicate, with the pointed toe characteristic of soft-soled boots. A woman's prints, or possibly those of a young man with small feet. Someone had been watching me, someone who now knew I'd found the hidden route to Morwenna's cave, who had seen me study the castle's secret passages, who understood that the Barren girl from the mountain village was far more dangerous than she appeared. I slipped out of the library and locked the door behind me, but the knowledge of those footprints followed me through the dark corridors like a second shadow. In a place where information was currency and secrets could kill, I had just revealed far too much of my hand.
The question now was whether my unknown watcher was friend or enemy, and whether I would live long enough to find out. Chapter 8. The Spy in the Apron. I made it back to the servants' quarters just as the first bell rang for morning duties, slipping into our chamber with what I hoped looked like casual timing. Vera was already awake, braiding her silver-streaked hair with quick, efficient movements. She glanced at me as I entered, took in my slightly rumpled gown and the dust on my slippers, and raised one knowing eyebrow. "Interesting night?" she asked quietly. "Educational," I replied, which was true enough. Penny and Joanna were still asleep, curled under their thin blankets like children despite their years. Looking at them, I felt a stab of something that might have been guilt. Here I was, playing games with ancient magic and deadly secrets, while they simply tried to survive each day without drawing unwanted attention. Maybe that was the wiser approach. But wisdom had never been my strong suit, and desperation made cowards of no one. I changed quickly out of the green silk gown and into my servant's gray shift, folding the fine fabric carefully and tucking Morwenna's diary deeper into its hidden pocket. The book seemed to pulse with warmth against my ribs, a constant reminder of the impossible knowledge it contained. "Olga will want to see you. The king's entertainment is expected to report after each evening." Report. That suggested Olga's interests went beyond simple servant management. What exactly did she want to know about my interactions with the beast? And more importantly, what would she do with that information? I found the housekeeper in her private chamber, a small but well-appointed room tucked between the servants' hall and the main kitchens. She looked up from a ledger as I knocked, her black eyes sharp as flint in the lamplight. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "Tell me about last night." I settled into the hard wooden seat and tried to look appropriately meek. "It went well, mistress. The beast seemed satisfied with my performance." "What did you talk about?" An interesting question. Most people would have asked what the beast looked like or whether it had tried to hurt me, but Olga wanted to know about conversation, as if the content of our discussions mattered more than my physical survival. "Stories," I said carefully. "It enjoys stories about transformation, about curses and magic, and it likes riddles." "What kind of stories did you tell?" "Personal ones, about loss, about surviving hardship. It seems to prefer truth to fantasy." Olga made a note in her ledger with a quill that scratched like claws on parchment. "And the riddles?" "Simple ones, ancient sayings my grandmother taught me." I paused, then decided to take a small risk. "Mistress, if I may ask, how long has the beast been in the East Wing?" Her hand stilled on the quill. "Long enough. Why do you ask?" "I'm trying to understand what it wants. The better I understand, the better I can serve." It was a reasonable explanation, but I could see she didn't entirely believe it. Her eyes narrowed as she studied my face, looking for tells that might reveal my true motives. "The beast has been the king's responsibility for 7 years, since the night Queen Isabel died in childbirth. The king was changed by his loss. He has not been seen in public since." 7 years? That aligned with other things I'd noticed. The way the castle felt hollow, despite being full of people, the nervous energy that seemed to permeate the staff, the sense that everyone was waiting for something terrible to happen. "The Queen's death must have been devastating," I said carefully. "Devastating enough." Olga set down her quill and fixed me with a stare that seemed to see straight through my skull. "You're intelligent, girl. more intelligent than most who've come before you. That could be an asset or a liability. Which it becomes depends entirely on how you choose to use that intelligence.
The warning was clear enough. Stay in my lane, play my assigned role, and I might survive. Start asking too many questions or poking into areas that weren't my concern, and I'd end up like the girls before me. I understand, mistress.
Do you? She leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. I've been running the servants' quarters in this castle for 23 years. I've seen kings rise and fall, queens come and go, nobles scheme and plot and tear each other apart in their hunger for power. Through it all, I've survived by understanding one simple truth. Knowledge is only valuable if you live long enough to use it. Message received. But as I nodded my understanding, I couldn't help wondering what knowledge Olga possessed that she considered too dangerous to share. What had she seen during her decades in the castle that made her so careful, so paranoid? And why did I get the feeling that her questions about my conversations with the beast went deeper than simple housekeeping concerns? She dismissed me with a wave, but as I reached the door, her voice stopped me. "Girl." I turned back. "Yes, mistress?" "Tonight will be different. The beast grows restless when it's been fed the same diet too long. Prepare accordingly." I left her chamber with those ominous words echoing in my mind. Restless. What did that mean exactly? That it would be less patient with my stories, more likely to lose control and lash out, or something else entirely? I made my way through the servants' corridors toward the kitchens, hoping to find Corin and perhaps get some answers about the library key he'd given me. The morning rush was in full swing, scullery maids hurrying with loads of laundry, stable boys carrying feed to the horses, kitchen staff preparing the midday meal for the castle's residents. I found him in a storage room off the main kitchen, counting sacks of flour with the methodical patience of someone who understood that mistakes in inventory could mean hungry people later. He looked up when I entered, his storm gray eyes flicking past me to make sure we weren't observed. "You used it," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Thank you. Find what you needed?" I considered how much to tell him. The boy had taken a risk helping me, which suggested either genuine kindness or an agenda of his own. Either way, I owed him something. "Some of it," I said carefully. "The library is remarkable." He smiled at that, an expression that transformed his serious young face. "It is. Most people think the old library is just storage for musty books nobody reads anymore. They don't understand what's really kept there." "And what is really kept there?" Corin glanced toward the kitchen door, then moved closer and lowered his voice to barely a whisper. "History. The real history, not the sanitized versions they teach in court. Records of the old magic, maps of places that officially don't exist anymore, treaties with kingdoms that were wiped from the official records." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're like me," he said simply, "wolfless in a world that values nothing else. And because—" He hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Because I think you might be the one the prophecies spoke of." My blood went cold. What prophecies? But before he could answer, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Corin immediately returned to his counting, raising his voice to a normal volume as he called out numbers. 47, 48, 49. A kitchen maid appeared in the doorway, a girl I didn't recognize, with moon-white hair and pale skin that seemed to glow in the dim storage room light. She looked between Corin and me with eyes like chips of winter sky, taking in our proximity and the way we'd both gone suddenly tense. She said, "Cook Marin needs the flour count," to Corin, her voice carrying an accent I couldn't place. something from the far north, where the winters lasted 8 months and the people learned to hoard words like grain. "Just finishing," Corn replied, making a note on his parchment. 50 sacks, all accounted for." The girl, Lark, I remembered Vera mentioning her, nodded and turned to go, but not before giving me a look that seemed to strip away all pretense and see straight to the secrets I carried. There was intelligence in those pale eyes, and calculation, and something else that made my skin prickle with warning. When she was gone, Corin let out a breath I hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Be careful around that one," he murmured. "She's not what she seems." "None of us are," I pointed out.
True, but some of us hide more dangerous things than others. He finished his inventory and headed for the door, but paused at the threshold to look back at me. "The prophecies I mentioned? They're in the library if you know where to look. Third shelf from the top, eastern wall, behind the books on herb lore. But be careful who you trust with what you find there. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share." With that cryptic warning, he was gone, leaving me alone among the sacks of flour and barrels of preserved vegetables. I stood there for several minutes, mind racing with new questions. Prophecies about someone like me? What could ancient magic possibly want with a barren girl from a mountain village? Unless... The thought that came to me was so audacious, so impossible, that I almost laughed. But the pieces were starting to fit together in ways that couldn't be coincidental. A curse that could only be broken by someone who understood transformation from the inside. A king trapped in monster form, isolated from his people for 7 years. A witch's diary that spoke of endings and beginnings, of daughters who belonged to neither world. What if my barrenness wasn't a curse at all, but a qualification? What if Morwenna hadn't stolen my fertility, but prepared me for something far more important than bearing children? The idea was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. If it was true, then everything I'd believed about myself, about my place in the world, was wrong. I wasn't broken or useless or surplus to be discarded when times grew hard. I was exactly what I needed to be. But first, I had to survive another night with the beast. And if Olga's warnings were accurate, tonight would test my newfound understanding in ways I wasn't prepared for. Chapter 9, The Third Night's Revelation. They dressed me in silver this time, a gown that caught the candlelight like captured starlight, with sleeves that flowed like water and a neckline that made the diamond collar look like natural ornamentation rather than a shackle. When I looked at myself in the small mirror in our chamber, I barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked like someone who belonged in a castle, someone who could stand beside kings and speak with authority. She looked like someone who had power. The illusion was dangerous. Power was something that had to be earned, not draped in silk and diamonds, and I couldn't afford to forget that I was still just a barren girl playing a game whose rules I barely understood. But as I walked through the corridors toward the east wing, I found myself moving differently. My spine was straighter, my steps more measured, my hands steady instead of trembling. Whether it was the knowledge I'd gained from Morwenna's diary, or simply the confidence that came from surviving 2 nights in the beast's presence, something fundamentally shifted in how I saw myself. The beast noticed the change immediately. "You look different tonight," it observed as I took my place at the table. "More substantial." "I feel different," I admitted. "Yesterday's conversation gave me much to think about." "And what conclusions did you reach?" I studied its face, that impossible blend of human intelligence and animal features that should have been terrifying, but instead seemed oddly beautiful in the candlelight. There was vulnerability there, carefully hidden, but unmistakable once you knew to look for it.
I concluded that we're more alike than either of us initially realized, I said. The beast went very still. How so? We're both trapped by circumstances beyond our control, both isolated from the world we once knew, both judged by appearances that don't reflect our true nature. I paused, then decided to take the risk. Both cursed by magic that was supposed to teach us something, but instead became a prison. For a moment, I thought I'd gone too far. The beast's claws extended, digging grooves in the table's surface, and its eyes flared with something that might have been anger or fear. Then it laughed. Not the grinding stone sound I'd heard before, but something closer to human amusement. Warm and rueful and achingly familiar. You read the diary, it said. I wondered if you would understand what it contained. Some of it. Enough to recognize the truth about what you are. I leaned forward, studying its expression. The question is, what do you intend to do with that knowledge? That depends, the beast said, on what you intend to do with it. We stared at each other across the table, two creatures caught between worlds, weighing trust against self-preservation. The candles flickered in their holders, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the night sounds of the castle. Guards calling to each other, the creak of settling stones, the whisper of wind through ancient corridors. I want to help you, I said finally, if you'll let me. Help me? The beast's tone was carefully neutral. And what makes you think I need help? Because you've been trapped in this form for 7 years, and in all that time, no one has been able to break the curse. Because you're so lonely, you risk exposing your true identity to a servant girl just for the chance of honest conversation. Because you keep that diary where you can see it every night, hoping against hope that someone will finally understand what it means.
The beast was quiet for a long time. When it finally spoke, its voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. You see too much, it whispered. I see what I need to see. Nothing more, nothing less. And what is it you think you see? I took a deep breath, preparing to gamble everything on intuition and hope. I see King Darius Aurelius, third of that name, ruler of the northern kingdoms, trapped by magic that was meant to humble him, but instead became a cage he can't escape. The beast flinched as if I'd struck it. Don't speak that name. It belongs to a dead man. Does it? Or does it belong to a man who's simply forgotten how to be human? I am not human. The words came out as a roar that shook dust from the rafters. Look at me. I am a monster, a thing of claws and fangs and hunger. I devour innocence and feast on fear. There is nothing human left in me. But even as it raged, I could see the lie in its golden eyes. The pain there wasn't the pain of a mindless beast. It was the agony of a man who had been cut off from everything that gave his life meaning. You're wrong, I said quietly. You're still human where it matters most. In here. I pressed my hand to my chest, over my heart. The monster is just the shape you wear. It's not who you are. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. I stood up, surprising myself with my boldness, and walked around the table toward the beast's chair. It tensed as I approached, but didn't retreat. I spent my entire adult life believing I was cursed, believing that my barrenness made me worthless, that my lack of a wolf made me less than human. But what if we're both wrong? What if our curses are actually gifts we haven't learned to unwrap yet? Gifts? What gift is there in being trapped between forms, neither fully human nor fully animal? What gift is there in inspiring fear instead of love,
and being avoided instead of sought after.
The gift of seeing clearly, I said. The gift of understanding what truly matters. The gift of recognizing kindred spirits when they appear, even if they wear unfamiliar faces. I reached out slowly, carefully, and laid my hand on its massive paw. Its claws could have shredded me in an instant, but instead they curled gently around my fingers with heartbreaking tenderness. "What is your name?" I asked softly. "Your real name, not your title or your crown. The name your mother called you when you scraped your knees or had nightmares." The beast's breathing grew ragged. I can't. The curse. The curse can only be broken by willing truth, by choosing to trust someone with the most vulnerable part of yourself. I squeezed its paw gently. "Trust me." For a heartbeat, I thought it would refuse. The habits of 7 years of isolation were hard to break, and vulnerability was a luxury monsters couldn't afford. Then it closed its golden eyes and whispered a single word. "Aurelian." The name hung in the air between us like a prayer, like a promise, like the first note of a song that had been waiting 7 years to be sung. And as it spoke, I felt something shift in the very foundations of the castle. Not a physical movement, but a loosening of bonds that had grown tight with pain and loneliness. "Hello, Aurelian," I said and smiled. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." When he opened his eyes, they were bright with unshed tears. "The curse is still there," I said gently. "Speaking your name was just the first step. The real work comes next." "What real work?" I thought of Morwenna's diary, of the hidden knowledge it contained, of the choice that lay before us both. Learning to forgive yourself for the man you used to be so you can become the man you're meant to be. The beast, Aurelian, studied my face in the candlelight. "And you think you can teach me that?" "I think we can teach each other. But first, there's something I need to tell you about why I'm really here." So I told him about the tax collector and my father's betrayal, about the map I'd come to steal and the witch I hoped to find, about my desperate plan to bargain for the return of my fertility, trading secrets for the chance to become the woman I'd always believed I was supposed to be. When I finished, Aurelian was quiet for a long time. "You realize," he said finally, "that if you help me break this curse, you'll lose your chance to find Morwenna. The magic that binds me to this form is connected to hers. When one breaks, the other will likely fade as well." I had realized that, actually. The thought had been growing in my mind ever since I'd read the diary, a cold certainty that I would have to choose between his freedom and my own hopes for motherhood. "I know," I said, "but maybe some things are more important than the life we plan to live. Maybe sometimes the greatest courage is in letting go of what we thought we wanted and embracing what we never knew we needed." Aurelian lifted his free paw to touch my cheek, the gesture aching and gentle despite his fearsome claws. "You would give up your greatest dream for a monster you've known for 3 days?" "I would give up my greatest dream for a good man trapped by circumstances beyond his control." I turned my face into his touch. "Besides, who says it has to be my greatest dream anymore? Dreams can change, Aurelian. People can change. Maybe the woman I'm becoming doesn't need to be a mother to be complete." "And what kind of woman are you becoming?" I thought about that. About the girl who had left her village in chains and the woman who now stood in a beast's banquet hall offering hope in exchange for trust. About the journey that had brought me here and the choices that lay ahead.
I'm becoming someone who understands her own worth, I said finally. Someone who knows that being different isn't the same as being broken. Someone who can look at a monster and see a man, and look at a curse and see a gift waiting to be unwrapped. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten outside the tall windows, but for the first time, neither of us moved toward the ritual of farewell that had ended our previous nights. Something had changed between us, some barrier had fallen, and we both seemed reluctant to break the spell of understanding that had woven itself around us. "Tomorrow night," Aurelian said, "will you come to me as yourself? No diamond collar, no silk gown, just the mountain girl with storm gray eyes and a storyteller's soul? If that's what you want, it is." He released my hand reluctantly, already beginning his retreat into shadow. I think it's time I remembered how to be human in the presence of someone who sees me as more than a monster. As I made my way back through the corridors toward the servants' quarters, I found myself thinking about choices and consequences, about the roads we take and the ones we leave behind. Tomorrow night would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new ways to fail or succeed. But for the first time since leaving my village, I felt like I was walking toward something instead of running away from it. And that, I thought, was worth any price I might have to pay. Chapter 10. The Raven's Message. I was braiding my hair by candlelight when she slipped into our chamber like smoke given form. Lark, the pale kitchen maid with winter sky eyes and secrets hiding behind her careful smile. She moved through our room with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to going unnoticed, checking the corners where shadows gathered before settling on Penny's empty bed. The youngest girl was on duty in the laundry, and Joanna had volunteered for late kitchen work, leaving just Vera and me to witness whatever game Lark was about to play. "Interesting conversation you had with the beast tonight," she said, without preamble, her voice carrying that northern accent that made every word sound like it was carved from ice. Vera looked up from her mending, eyes sharp with sudden alertness. "How would you know what they talked about?" Lark smiled, an expression that was all teeth and no warmth. "The castle has many ears for those who know how to listen, and some of us have been listening for a very long time." My blood went cold. If she'd overheard my conversation with Aurelian, if she knew about the diary and the curse and the choice that lay ahead. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the fear that clawed at my throat. "To help," she said, simply. "Believe it or not, we're on the same side." "And what side is that?" Instead of answering directly, Lark reached into her apron and pulled out a small piece of parchment, folded and sealed with black wax. The seal bore a symbol I recognized from my studies of the old histories. A wolf's head surrounded by thorns, the mark of the Grey Paw Rebellion. There are those who believe the current regime has outlived its usefulness, those who think the kingdom would benefit from new leadership. I stared at the offered message without taking it. The Grey Paw had been fighting the crown for decades, using guerrilla tactics and underground networks to undermine royal authority. They were considered terrorists by the nobility, freedom fighters by the oppressed, and dangerous radicals by everyone in between. "What could they possibly want with me? I'm a servant girl," I said. "What use could your rebellion have for someone like me?" Lark's smile widened, showing more teeth than any human expression should contain. "You underestimate yourself, Thessa, of the mountain village. You're the first person to survive 3 nights with the beast. More than that, you're the first to win its trust, to earn its confidence, to get close enough to learn its secrets." Understanding hit me like a physical blow. They didn't want my help with their rebellion. They wanted me to assassinate Aurelian. "You want me to kill him," I said, not bothering to hide my revulsion. "We want you to free the kingdom from a tyrant," Lark corrected. The beast may wear a different face than the king, but they serve the same master. End one, and you end the other. If only she knew how literally true that was. And if I refuse? Lark's expression didn't change, but something cold moved behind her winter-pale eyes. Then you'll have chosen your side, and will act accordingly. The Gray Paw has been patient, but patience has its limits. The threat was clear enough: cooperate or be eliminated as an obstacle to their plans. I wondered how many others had faced similar choices over the years, how many had bent to their will, and how many had simply disappeared. But they'd made one crucial error in their calculations. They assumed I would value my own survival over Aurelian's. They assumed the bond between us was still shallow enough to break under pressure. They were wrong. I need time to think, I said finally, not reaching for the parchment. Time is a luxury none of us can afford much longer, Lark said, but she tucked her message back into her apron. The full moon rises tomorrow night. That's when the beast is weakest, when its human side fights hardest against the monster within. Strike then, and you'll face less resistance. She stood to leave, but paused at the door to look back at me. One more thing, Thessa of the mountain village. Your kitchen boy friend Corin, he's been asking questions about you. Dangerous questions. You might want to be more careful about who you trust with your secrets. With that parting shot, she melted back into the shadows as silently as she'd come, leaving me alone with Vera and the weight of impossible choices.
Well, Vera said after a long moment, setting down her mending with hands that shook only slightly. That was illuminating. You knew she was Greypaw? I suspected. Her accent, the way she moved, the questions she asked, all consistent with someone who'd been trained in covert operations. Vera's expression was grim. The question is, what are you going to do about it? What indeed? If I refused to help them, they would likely try to eliminate both Aurelian and me. If I pretended to cooperate, I might be able to mislead them, but only until they discovered the deception. And if I warned Aurelian about the threat, I would be putting my trust in a man I'd known for only 3 days, a man who was still more beast than human despite the progress we'd made. I don't know, I admitted. I need to think. Think quickly, Vera advised. People like Lark don't make idle threats. If she says the full moon is their deadline, you can be sure they're already moving pieces into position. I lay awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling while my roommate slept, and questions chased each other in endless circles through my mind. How long had the Grey Paw been planning this? How many other servants were secretly working for them? And most importantly, was there any way to save Aurelian without destroying everything I'd worked for? By morning, I'd reached a decision that was equal parts desperate and determined. I was going to tell him everything. Chapter 11. The King's Choice. You look troubled, Aurelian observed as I entered the banquet hall that evening. He was right. I'd abandoned the elaborate gowns Olga provided, choosing instead to wear my simple gray servant's shift. No diamond collar glared at my throat. No jewels adorned my hair. I came to him as myself, the barren girl from the mountain village, stripped of artificial glamour and silk-wrapped lies. I'd expected the change to diminish me somehow, to make me feel small and insignificant in the face of his terrible majesty. Instead, I felt more powerful than I had in any of the borrowed finery. This was who I was, who I'd always been beneath the masks others had tried to make me wear. I am troubled, I said, taking my place at the table. We need to talk. His golden eyes sharpened with attention. About what? About the fact that you're going to be murdered tomorrow night if we don't do something to stop it? The words fell into the space between us like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and disbelief across his bestial features.
For a moment, he simply stared at me, as if I'd spoken in a language he didn't understand. Then the implications hit him, and his claws extended, with a sound like swords being drawn. "Explain," he rumbled, voice carrying the undertone of barely controlled violence that reminded me exactly what kind of creature I was dealing with. So I told him everything. About Lark's midnight visit and the Grey Paw Rebellion, about their plan to strike during tomorrow night's full moon when his human side would be weakest. I described their network of sympathizers within the castle, their belief that killing him would somehow free the kingdom from tyranny. When I finished, Aurelian was quiet for a long time. He stared at his claws, flexing them rhythmically, and I could see the war playing out behind his eyes. The human king calculating political necessities against the beast's instinct to solve problems with violence. "How long have you known?" he asked finally. "Since last night." Lark approached me after I returned from our conversation. "And yet, you chose to warn me instead of taking their offer?" It wasn't really a question, but I answered anyway. "Of course I did. Did you think 3 nights of stories meant so little to me?" He looked up at that, studying my face in the candlelight. Most people would have seen this as an opportunity, a chance to ingratiate themselves with the winning side, a chance to gain favor with whoever emerges victorious from the chaos. I'm not most people. "No," he agreed softly. "You're not." He stood and began pacing the length of the banquet hall, his massive form moving with predatory grace, despite his obvious agitation. I watched him think, seeing the gears turning behind those golden eyes as he worked through options and consequences. "The Grey Paw believes the beast and the king are separate entities," he said eventually. "That killing one won't affect the other. Yes, they don't know about the curse, which means they don't understand that assassination isn't just murder, it's suicide. If they succeed in killing this form, they'll also kill the man trapped within it. Unless, of course, the curse is broken before they strike." My breath caught. "Are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we have less than 24 hours to accomplish what 7 years of isolation couldn't achieve." His voice was grim but determined. "Either we break this curse by tomorrow night, or the kingdom loses its king and gains nothing but chaos in return." The magnitude of what he was proposing hit me like a physical blow. Break a curse that had defeated the kingdom's best scholars and most powerful mages in a single day? It seemed impossible. But then again, impossible had been my specialty lately. "What do we need to do?" I asked. Aurelian smiled, the first genuinely human expression I'd seen from him, transforming his monstrous features into something achingly beautiful. "We need to remember what Morwenna wrote in her diary. The curse can be broken when the one who cast it learns the true nature of powerlessness, when the lesson she intended to teach has finally been understood." "But Morwenna cast the curse. How can you learn a lesson meant for her?" "Because the curse was never really about me," he said quietly. "It was about her. Her pride, her arrogance, her belief that she could reshape human nature through magic and suffering. I was just the tool she used to teach herself a lesson she wasn't ready to learn." I thought about that, turning the idea over in my mind like a puzzle piece that might fit if I could just find the right angle. So breaking the curse isn't about you becoming worthy of freedom. It's about her becoming worthy of redemption. Exactly. And the only way she can learn that lesson is by seeing the consequences of her actions reflected in someone who shares her fundamental nature. Someone else who has experienced the isolation that comes with being neither one thing nor another. understanding dawned like sunrise after a long dark night. Someone like me. Someone exactly like you. Barren but not broken. Wolfless but not weak. Cursed with isolation but blessed with the ability to see clearly because of it. I stood and walked around the table toward him, my heart hammering with the mixture of terror and exhilaration. What do I need to do? Be yourself, he said simply. Stand before her as living proof that her definition of power was wrong. That strength doesn't come from the ability to change others, but from the willingness to accept change yourself. And you think that will be enough?
I think, he said, reaching out to cut my face with one massive clawed hand, that you've already been breaking curses just by existing, mine included. The truth of that hit me like lightning. I had been changing him, just as he'd been changing me. The monster who demanded entertainment from a succession of terrified girls was gone, replaced by a man who was learning to trust again, to hope again, to believe in the possibility of redemption. If I could do that for him, maybe I could do the same for the witch who'd created us both. Where do we find her? I asked. We don't, Aurelian said. She comes to us. Tomorrow night, when the full moon rises and the barriers between worlds grow thin, she'll be drawn back to the place where her greatest work was completed. She'll come here, to this castle, to see what her curse has wrought. And then we show her what it means to be truly powerful. He stroked my cheek with heartbreaking gentleness. Together. As dawn approached, neither of us spoke of the dangers that lay ahead. We both knew the risks, that Morwenna might refuse to lift the curse, that the gray paw might strike before we had a chance to act, or that our fragile connection might not be strong enough to work magic that had eluded greater minds than ours. But for the first time since arriving at the castle, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. Not as a servant or an entertainment or a pawn in someone else's game, but as a partner in something larger than either of us could accomplish alone. Whatever tomorrow brought, we would face it together. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Chapter 12. The Witch's Return. The full moon rose like a silver eye opening in the darkness, casting the castle in ethereal light that made shadows dance and stone shimmer like water. I stood at the window in our servant's chamber, watching its ascent with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Tonight would change everything, one way or another. Vera had taken Penny and Joanna to the lower levels, claiming the need to inventory supplies in the deep storage rooms, far from whatever chaos might erupt in the East Wing. It was a kindness I didn't ask for, but desperately appreciated. Whatever happened tonight, I didn't want innocent blood on my conscience. Lark had visited again at sunset, her pale eyes glittering with anticipation as she pressed a small vial into my hands. Poison, she'd explained with that cold smile. One drop in its drink, and the beast will sleep forever. Quick, painless, and impossible to trace. I'd taken the vial without protest, tucked it into my shift's hidden pocket next to Morwenna's diary. Let her believe I had accepted her offer. The truth would reveal itself soon enough. Now I made my way through corridors that seemed charged with electric possibility. Every shadow potentially concealing an assassin. Every whisper of wind carrying the promise of transformation. The castle felt different tonight, more alive, more aware, as if ancient magic was stirring in its bones. The East Wing hummed with power when I entered. Candles flaring brighter than usual, and mirrors reflecting not just my image, but strange glimpses of other times, other places. In one, I saw a young man with kind eyes and a crown that seemed too heavy for his head. In another, a woman with my face, but different clothes, different bearing.
someone who had never known the weight of barrenness or exile. Echoes of what was, what might have been, what could still be. Aurelian was waiting for me in the banquet hall, but tonight he wasn't alone. At the far end of the room, wreathed in shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source, stood a figure that made my blood freeze and my heart race in equal measure. Morwenna. She looked exactly as I remembered from that terrible day 5 winters ago. Ageless face framed by silver-streaked hair, eyes like chips of obsidian that seemed to see straight through flesh and bone to the soul beneath. She wore the same midnight blue robes embroidered with phases of the moon, the same silver circlet that marked her as a witch of the old blood. But there were differences too, subtle signs of the years that had passed, lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, a tremor in her hands that suggested power held too tightly for too long, and something in her expression, a wariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. She looked like someone who was tired of carrying burdens alone. "So," she said, her voice carrying the same melodic cadence I remembered. The Barren girl finally found her way to me, though not, I think, in the manner she originally intended. I stepped into the hall, acutely aware of the 2 powerful beings watching my every move. Aurelian's golden eyes were warm with encouragement, but Morwenna's gaze was calculating, assessing, waiting to see what I would choose to become in this moment of truth. "No," I agreed. "My intentions have evolved considerably since I first sought you out."
Have they indeed? She moved further into the light, and I saw that she wasn't quite solid. Moonbeams passed through her edges, and her footsteps made no sound on the marble floor. She was here, but not here, existing in the space between worlds that opened only during the full moon. "And what intentions drive you now, child?" "The intention to break a curse that has caused enough suffering." Morwenna laughed, a sound like silver bells wrapped in ice. "How presumptuous! A mountain peasant thinks to undo the work of one trained in the deepest mysteries of transformation magic." "Not undo," I corrected, finding my courage in the face of her disdain. "Complete. Your spell was meant to teach a lesson, wasn't it? About the true nature of power, about what it means to be isolated from those you're meant to protect." Her laughter died, replaced by an expression I couldn't quite read. "Continue." I looked at Aurelian, drawing strength from his presence, then turned back to face the witch who had shaped both our destinies. "You cursed a young king because you saw in him the same pride that drove your own choices, the belief that power meant the ability to control others, to reshape the world according to your will without considering the consequences." "He was a tyrant," Morwenna said, but there was less conviction in her voice than I had expected. "Cruel, arrogant, deaf to his people's suffering." "He was young," I countered, "inexperienced, surrounded by advisors who told him what they thought he wanted to hear instead of what he needed to know. He made mistakes, yes, but nothing that couldn't be corrected with time and wisdom." "You defend him?" "I defend the man he's become. 7 years of isolation have taught him what you wanted him to learn, that true power comes from understanding, not domination, from connection, not control." Morwenna's eyes flickered to Aurelian, studying his monstrous form with an expression that might have been regret. "And you believe this justifies releasing him from the consequences of his actions?" "I believe," I said carefully, "that the lesson has been learned,
by both of you." She went very still at that, and I felt the temperature in the room drop by several degrees. When she spoke again, her voice carried the kind of cold that could freeze blood in veins. "Explain." I took a deep breath, knowing that my next words would determine whether we all walked away from this encounter alive. Your curse wasn't just about teaching him humility. It was about confronting your own nature. The part of you that believed magic gave you the right to decide other people's fates without their consent.
Careful, child. You've spent 7 years watching the consequences of your choices, I continued, pressing forward despite the danger radiating from her form. 7 years seeing how your attempt to create justice through suffering only created more suffering. 7 years learning what it means to be truly powerless, not because you lack magic, but because magic alone can't fix the damage pride creates. Morwenna's hands clenched into fists, and the shadows around her writhed like living things. "You know nothing of power or its cost." "Don't I?" I stepped closer, letting her see the truth in my eyes. "I know what it's like to be defined by what you lack instead of what you possess. I know the weight of carrying shame for circumstances beyond your control. I know the isolation that comes when others see you as broken, less than, surplus to be discarded when convenient." Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the icy composure she wore like armor. "You cursed me too, didn't you?" I said quietly. "Not with barrenness, that was just a convenient excuse. You cursed me with the same isolation you inflicted on him, the same separation from the world I was meant to inhabit. You made me the perfect mirror for his condition, someone who could understand his pain because I carried the same wound." "I made you free," she whispered. And for the first time, her voice carried uncertainty instead of absolute conviction. "I made you alone, but you also made me strong in ways I never would have discovered otherwise." I reached into my shift and pulled out her diary, holding it between us like an offering. "You wrote the truth in here, even if you weren't ready to face it then. The curse can only be broken by someone who understands transformation from the inside. Someone who has learned to find worth in being different instead of shame in being incomplete." I looked at Ariellen, then back at Morwenna, feeling the weight of destiny settling around us like a cloak. You created two outcasts who could recognize each other across the divide that separates monster from maiden, king from commoner, cursed from blessed. You gave us the gift of seeing clearly because we had nothing left to lose by facing the truth. "And what truth is that?" Morwenna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That power without compassion is just another form of weakness. That wisdom without humility becomes cruelty. That none of us can heal alone. We need witnesses to our transformation, companions for the journey, people who see our potential even when we've forgotten it ourselves." I held out my hand to Ariellen, and he took it without hesitation, his claws gentle against my skin. Together we faced the witch whose magic had brought us together. "You wanted him to learn that being a true king meant serving his people instead of ruling them," I said. "You wanted him to understand that strength comes from vulnerability, that the greatest leaders are those who admit their mistakes and grow from them. Well, he's learned those lessons. The question is whether you've learned yours. And what lesson is that supposed to be?" But there was no fire in her challenge anymore, only exhaustion. That redemption is possible for anyone willing to choose it. That mistakes can be teaching tools instead of permanent stains. That even witches who meddle with forces beyond their complete understanding can find their way back to wisdom. Morwenna was quiet for a long time, her obsidian eyes moving between Aurelian and me as if seeing us truly for the first time. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and wondering. "You love him." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Yes. Not the king,
Not the crown or the power or the position, the man trapped inside the monster. The man who listened to my stories without judgment, who saw strength in my scars instead of shame in my failures, who trusted me with his real name when he'd forgotten it himself. I squeezed Aurelian's paw gently. Yes, I love him. And you? Morvena turned to Aurelian. Do you love her? More than my kingdom, he said without hesitation. More than my crown. More than the human form I've spent 7 years trying to reclaim. His golden eyes met mine. She saw past the monster to the man beneath, but more than that, she made me want to be worthy of what she saw. Even knowing what it would cost her? Even understanding that breaking your curse might destroy her chance of ever bearing children. I felt Aurelian's start of surprise, his claws tightening involuntarily around my hand. He turned to stare at me, golden eyes wide with understanding and something that might have been horror. You knew that freeing me would eliminate any possibility of finding your own cure, and you chose to help me anyway. Some things are more important than the dreams we think we want, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the pain that clawed at my heart. Some people are worth any sacrifice. But your fertility was never the source of my worth. I turned to face him fully, letting him see the truth in my eyes. I thought being barren made me broken, but it just made me different. It gave me the capacity to love without possessiveness, to nurture without needing to control, to find purpose in lifting others up instead of creating new life. That's not fair to ask of you. You're not asking. I'm choosing. I touched his face gently, marveling at the way he leaned into my touch despite his fearsome appearance. I choose you, Aurelian. I choose this love, this moment, this chance to break a curse that has caused enough suffering. I choose to believe that sometimes the greatest magic happens when we stop trying to change ourselves and start accepting what we are. Morwena watched this exchange with an expression that grew increasingly complex. Surprise giving way to understanding, understanding blooming into something that might have been hope. You're willing to sacrifice your greatest desire for his freedom, she said slowly, and he would rather remain cursed and cost you your dreams. Neither of you seeks power over the other. Neither demands that love reshape the beloved into something different. No, I said simply, we don't. Then perhaps, Morwena said, raising her hands and speaking words in a language older than kingdoms, it's time for all of us to be free. The magic that erupted from her fingertips was nothing like the dark sorcery I'd expected. It was silver and gold and pearl white, colors that had no names in any human tongue. It flowed around Aurelian like liquid starlight, sinking into his fur and flesh and bone until he blazed like a captured sun. But instead of pain, his transformation brought joy. Instead of loss, it brought completion. I watched in wonder as the beast's form began to shift, to soften, to become something new. Not the monster disappearing to reveal the hidden man, but both natures merging into something greater than either had been alone. When the light finally faded, Aurelian stood before me in his true form, tall and broad-shouldered, with kind eyes and strong hands, and a face that bore the wisdom earned through years of suffering. He was beautiful in the way that mountains are beautiful, or storms, or the first light of dawn after the darkest night. But more than that, he was free. The curse is broken, Morwena announced, though her voice sounded strange, lighter somehow, as if she too had been transformed by the magic she'd woven. Wait, I called out, suddenly understanding what her sacrifice meant. The curse that bound you to this existence, if his is broken, then yours is finally ending as well, she said with a smile that held more peace than I'd ever seen in her obsidian eyes. I have been trapped between life and death, bound by the magic I wielded without wisdom, unable to rest until the damage was healed. Now, at last, I can let go. Will you be all right? I asked, surprised by my own concern for the woman who had caused us all so much pain. I will be what I was always meant to be, she said. Free to make new choices, to seek redemption instead of revenge, to learn what love means when it's given freely instead of demanded through magic. As she faded completely, her final words echoed in the banquet hall like a benediction. May you both find the happiness that comes from choosing each other every day, not because you must, but because you want to. And then we were alone, Aurelian and I, two former outcasts standing in a room full of candles and mirrors and the lingering scent of magic that had finally, truly been used for healing instead of harm. He reached for me with hands that were completely human now, pulling me into an embrace that felt like coming home after a journey I'd never realized I was taking. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "About giving up your chance for children, for the life you thought you wanted?" I looked into his eyes, brown now instead of gold, warm with human love instead of supernatural fire, and felt my heart settle into perfect certainty. "I'm sure," I said, "because this isn't giving up the life I wanted. This is discovering the life I was meant to have all along." When he kissed me, it tasted like freedom and starlight and promises that would never be broken by pride or fear or the small cruelties that had once defined us both. Outside the tall windows, the full moon began its descent toward dawn, and somewhere in the castle's depths, I heard the sound of voices raised in celebration as word spread that their king had returned. But in the banquet hall of the East Wing, we held each other and marveled at the magic that had transformed us both. Not the sorcery that had trapped us in forms we didn't choose, but the deeper magic of choosing to love without conditions, to trust without guarantees, to believe in the possibility of redemption even when it seemed impossible.
The harvest that came 1 year later. I stood on the balcony of the royal apartments, watching the sun set over the kingdom that had become my home in ways I'd never imagined possible. The harvest festival was in full swing below, market stalls filled with the season's bounty, children running between the vendors with ribbons streaming from their hair, musicians playing songs that made even the most dignified nobles tap their feet in time. The past year had brought changes that went far deeper than a curse being broken. Aurelian ruled now not as a distant, feared king, but as a leader who understood intimately what it meant to be cast out, to be different, to struggle for acceptance in a world that valued conformity above compassion. Laws had changed. The practice of using daughters as currency to settle debts was outlawed entirely. Marriage required mutual consent from both parties, regardless of family financial pressures. And perhaps most importantly, a series of clinics had been established throughout the kingdom. Places where healers studied the mysteries of fertility and barrenness, not as curses to be ashamed of, but as natural variations deserving of understanding and support. I'd helped design those clinics, working with scholars and midwives and women who had their own stories of loss and hope. It was work that gave me purpose in ways I'd never expected, ways that had nothing to do with bearing children and everything to do with nurturing the parts of people that needed healing. "Deep thoughts?" Aurelian asked, emerging onto the balcony behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist. Even a year later, I still marveled at the simple miracle of his human warmth, the way he could hold me without fear of claws accidentally drawing blood. "Happy thoughts," I corrected, leaning back against his chest. I was thinking about how different everything is now. Better different or worse different? Definitely better. I turned in his arms to face him, studying the face that had become as familiar to me as my own. "Do you ever miss it? The beast form, I mean? The strength, the enhanced senses?" He considered that seriously, as he considered most of my questions.
It was one of the things I loved about him, the way he treated my curiosity as something valuable rather than amusing.
Smooth talker, I teased, but my heart warmed at his words. I've had excellent coaching in the art of meaningful conversation. We stood together in comfortable silence, watching the celebration below and the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. It was peaceful in a way that still surprised me sometimes. Peace had been so rare in my early life that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Thessa, Aurelian said suddenly, his voice carrying a note I couldn't quite identify. There's something I need to tell you. My heart skipped, trained by years of disappointment to expect bad news. What is it? Instead of answering immediately, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, worn smooth by handling. I had this made for you months ago, but I wasn't sure. That is, I didn't know if... He was stammering, which was so unlike his usual composed demeanor that I felt a flutter of genuine concern. Aurelian, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong, he said quickly. Everything's right. That's the problem. It's so right that I'm terrified of ruining it by presuming too much. Understanding began to dawn, warm and bright as sunrise. I'm asking if you'll marry me, he said in a rush, opening the box to reveal a ring that made my breath catch. It wasn't elaborate, a simple band of white gold set with a single stone that captured and reflected light like trapped starlight. Not because it's expected, not because it would be politically advantageous, but because I love you and I want to spend every day for the rest of my life choosing you all over again. I stared at the ring, then at his face, anxious and hopeful and vulnerable in ways that reminded me powerfully of the man I'd first glimpsed beneath the beast's frightening exterior. Yes, I said, and watched joy transform his features like sunrise over mountains. Of course, yes. He slipped the ring onto my finger with hands that shook slightly, and I marveled at how perfectly it fit. Not just my finger, but my life, my dreams, the woman I'd become through loving and being loved in return. There's more, he said, still holding my hand. The ring isn't the only thing I wanted to give you. Before I could ask what he meant, a small commotion erupted near the palace entrance below. I looked down to see a familiar figure making her way through the crowd. Vera, moving with the quick, efficient steps I remembered, but wearing clothes far finer than any servant could afford. Is that... Your former roommate, yes. I offered her a position as head of the new fertility clinics. She accepted, along with the house and stipend that come with the role. Aurelian's eyes crinkled with amusement. She was very specific about wanting to surprise you. I laughed, feeling tears prick my eyes for reasons I couldn't entirely explain. You brought her here? I brought several people here. His expression grew more serious, including someone I think you'll especially want to see. He gestured toward the palace entrance, and my heart stopped entirely when I saw who emerged into the torchlight. Mira, my sister, grown beautiful and confident, dressed in traveling clothes and looking around with wide eyes that held all the wonder and excitement of someone seeing the capital for the first time. How? I breathed. Letters, Aurelian said simply. Carefully worded inquiries through trusted intermediaries. Your father was resistant at first, but gold has a way of overcoming moral objections. She's here for the wedding, if you'll have her. And if she chooses to stay afterward, there's a place for her in the palace. Not as a servant, but as a welcomed member of our family. I couldn't speak past the lump in my throat, could barely see through the tears that blurred my vision. After a year of happiness, I thought I was content with the life I'd built.
But having my sister here, seeing the possibility of reconnecting with the only family member who had ever truly mattered to me, it felt like a gift I'd never dared to hope for. "Thank you," I managed finally. You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he said firmly. "You've given me everything: freedom, love, a kingdom worth ruling instead of just controlling. The least I can do is try to give you back some of what you sacrificed to save me." I kissed him then, there on the balcony overlooking the harvest festival, with my sister below and my future shining like the ring on my finger. It was a kiss that tasted like coming home and setting out on new adventures all at once. When we finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing, I realized something that would have amazed the girl who'd left her mountain village in chains. I was completely, perfectly happy. Not because my life had turned out the way I'd originally planned. It hadn't, not even close. But because I'd learned to find joy in the unexpected, strength in the unwanted, and love in the places I least expected to discover it.
"So," Aurelian said, his arm tightening around my waist as we looked out over the kingdom we would rule together. "What do you think? Was it worth it? Giving up your original dream for this one?" I thought about that question seriously, the way he taught me to approach all important considerations. I thought about the girl I'd been, desperate for children, defined by what she lacked, convinced that her barrenness made her worthless. I thought about the woman I'd become, healer, counselor, queen-to-be, partner to a man who valued her mind as much as her heart. I thought about the children I would never bear and the countless lives I'd already touched through the clinics and the new laws and the simple act of proving that worth wasn't determined by fertility or wolf blood or any other arbitrary measure society chose to impose. It was worth it, I said, and meant every word. All of it. The pain, the fear, the uncertainty. It was worth it to end up here, with you, knowing that we chose each other freely and completely. Even the curse? Especially the curse, I smiled up at him. After all, if Morwenna hadn't decided to teach you humility through transformation, you never would have needed someone who understood what it meant to be trapped between worlds. And I never would have discovered that being different wasn't the same as being broken. Below us, the harvest festival continued in full swing, celebrating abundance and community and the promise of tomorrow. Above us, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, constant and beautiful and infinite. And between earth and sky, two former outcasts held each other and marveled at the magic that had brought them together. Not the sorcery of spells and curses, but the deeper magic of choosing love over fear, growth over stagnation, hope over despair. It was, I thought, as I watched my sister navigate the crowd below while wearing a grin of pure delight, the best kind of harvest anyone could hope for, the kind that fed the soul as well as the body, and promised to sustain us through whatever seasons lay ahead.